I think one of the successes of this conference is that we have three wonderful women with us as keynote speakers. We had Sarah yesterday. Thank you, Sarah. Hi. And today it's Sharmin's turn. So Sarah is an academic. She's a professor. Sharmin is a fighter. She's a soldier. And we are really very proud and very happy that we can share these moments with her, because she has invented, she has tried very hard to create a contemporary, alternative, new model of doing real journalism, which is the discussion of the days, and digital, so as I said, contemporary, new, digital, free, independent, if I can say, because she's not getting sponsored from advertisement or from government money or from any other money, but she's gonna tell you more about that. And she's the senior editor, if I'm not mistaken, of Real News Network. And I have to also add that we must be, if we're not yet, live on Real News Network. She's going to tell you more about that. And we are really very happy to share, as I said, these moments with her. So Sharmini, welcome, and the floor is yours.
It is such a pleasure to be here. Do I need a mic, by the way? Should I move this here? Yeah. Okay. Can I do this? Okay. Can you hear me? Is this okay? Okay, there's too many things here. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sophia. And yes, Sophia, I am thrilled to be here. I'm honored, in fact, to be among such a trusted gathering of a brain trust in this historic city at a conference so brilliantly titled Media, Agora, Democracy in a Digital Era. So when I saw that, I couldn't possibly say no. And then, of course, to know that an open university of Cyprus and others were co-sponsors of this wonderful conference. And so that is why I'm here. I don't get to get out of my editing studio very often anymore. but I've made this a priority, because I think it's very important for us to depart what we have learned as journalists in the last 15 years, that the real news has been in existence. And I will give you a little bit of that history. But to begin with, I want to draw your attention to the real news. Can I give hands up of how many people are familiar with the real news? Okay, so I will then start. There's probably about 10 people who've put their hands up. So let me start with saying that we are a media outfit that is video news. We also have articles, we have print, but we are mostly a video source. And we've done that deliberately, because if you read some of the surveys and mostly the surveys that have been done, like with Pew or Oxford University and others, most ordinary people get their news from watching television. And that's the audience we wanted to reach. People that largely read news is much less. It's largely who read news on a regular basis, like the New York Times, is really the ruling elite. It's the upper classes. It is not the ordinary person working in a factory or coming home after a long day on their feet. They want to come home, have their dinner, plop down on their couch, and turn on the tube, and then get their news in that way. And so the Real News has focused on that segment of the population because we want to appeal to ordinary people, the working class, because I think that is the segment of the population that is most ignored by mainstream television. In fact, when we started the Real News, we did a Zogby survey and asked, would they be willing to support a television network that was, support meaning will they make a donation to the to a network that was in the interest of their everyday lives and in the interest of them, because what they mostly see on television is the ruling elite. It's about Wall Street, it's about who's in power in Washington, and rarely do they see their own stories and their struggle to live and having lack of health care, lack of jobs, lack of well-paid jobs. These issues are minor in the scheme of things. So we got almost 80% of the people we surveyed saying, yes, they're willing to support a network of news that reflected their realities. So that was an indication to us that we needed to be on television, we needed to be on video, and that we needed to tell our stories using video as a medium. So that's our primary focus because of the surveys we had done. Now, we also are committed to having no advertising on the Real News Network. So we don't have any corporate ad, or some progressive sites will have progressive books as advertising on the right-hand column. If you go to many outfits, they will do progressive advertising. We take no advertising because if there's a progressive movement out there or a progressive political party, we would like to be able to critique them and be true to our journalistic mission. So we take no advertising from anyone. We take no government funding, and we take no corporate dollars of any sort, including advertising or sponsorships or anything like that. So it begs the question, how do you do it? I will get to that. So what we are essentially is a member-supported news network that's free to watch, but those who can make a contribution to the endeavor we are engaged in makes a donation. Some of them $10 a month, some of them $5 a month. We often get little envelopes in the mail saying, I work at Walmart, I've just lost my job, so this is the last contribution I can make to you, but as soon as I get another job, I'll resume. We get notes and letters and emails from so many people, students who are saying, you know, I can't afford it, but when I finally get a job, I will, but thanks for doing what you're doing now. And largely, this keeps us going. You know, it's inspirational, the kind of support we have gotten. Now, what we do in our model in terms of funding is essentially, we're asking anybody out there, individuals out there, who can afford to give whatever they can give. And some of them are, you know, 50,000, some of them are 20,000, some of them are 10,000, and like I said, some of them are 5,000, some of them are $5. There's a whole group of people that give $1 a day. So that's how we fund the Real News. And this was made possible really during the 2004 presidential campaign in the United States, when candidates running for office was getting donations, the comfort level of people giving online, shopping online, the donations online, giving to causes online for various disasters using your credit card. When that became normalized in the West, that's when we found we had an opportunity to seize, and that's when the real news really got off the ground. And that was about 15 years ago. And I think this is a very good model. It's not enough for doing the things we want to do. It's not enough to do, real investigative work. It's not enough to do the gamut of things we need to do. But if we are able to, what we say, make the next giant leap forward from what we are doing, if we can really go viral, or if we can really accelerate our members, we can create that capacity to do more investigative work, to do more bureaus, to do more reach into the rest of the world. But in the meantime, we've come up with ways in which to do that without the finances we have. So one example of reaching the world, for example, is, as you can see on our site, we have the 73rd UN General Assembly. And General Assembly is often watched by the world because there, if you click on that, you'll see their presidents. How quickly this will go there, but maybe, there we go. So we have all the speeches of the various presidents at the United Nations giving their, never mind, I can't seem to scroll down, but you'll see that we will have all the presidents from all over the world, heads of states who are giving their General Assembly address. We'll feature them. We'll put them up on here, mostly because there are people watching from all over the world, and there's no internet source that actually has them. And even if the General Assembly site has these speeches, and they do, I don't know if you've ever tried looking for them. It's very difficult to find the General Assembly television station where these speeches are featured. But not only, we also do criticism. We also analyze the speeches, and you'll see when you go to the Real News, you'll see a number of stories where we have actually done that, which is we've taken Rouhani's speech and we've analyzed it. We've talked to some experts on Iran about it. We actually did a very good piece on Trump's speech, and mostly about the way in which the United States has now been internationally laughed at. And I don't know if any of you got to see the speech that Trump gave at the United Nations. I've been and I've covered the United Nations. I've been at the United Nations as a delegation. I have never in my life, of my professional life, seen this kind of ridiculing of the president of any country, let alone the President of the United States. And I'm saying this because, we are in a unique period in history, and I cannot stress that more. I think, we are all so overworked. We are all following the news. We know that, when you're looking at what's going on in the world, you know that. But the accumulative impact of the world we live in today, as a journalist, when I draw back and I, sort of Google Earth out and I look at what is going on in the world, we are in an existential crisis. And I'm saying this because when I saw Trump give that speech at the United Nations, and he made this ridiculous claim that in the 2 years that he had been president, that the United States had accomplished more than in the history of the nation. It was so ridiculous, the whole General Assembly bursted out in laughter. And he himself had to laugh at himself because he realized the ridiculousness of that statement. Because everyone's saying, well, what about the founding fathers? What about Lincoln? What about, it was so obvious he had to laugh at himself. And I've never seen, the UN is a serious place. You know that, Sophia, it's a serious place. People, you don't do that. Even if you disagreed, you don't laugh at a president, particularly not one of this powerful as the United States. So what has happened, let's say even if we were to take the United Nations as an example, the United Nations over the years, particularly since the Bush administration to now, and I have to say including the Obama administration's period, some of Clinton's work as well, it has been rendered absolutely futile. It is no longer respected as an institution that governs the world, that tries to avoid war, that protects human rights, that are fundamentally there in order to govern the world. It's been, slowly, it's been defunded by nations like the US because it cannot flex its muscles the way it would like to. In fact, it tries on a regular basis. And so we don't really have a governing body for the world anymore that's functional. And people like Kofi Annan tried to reform it, tried to introduce more democracy to the process, and yet, it's a Security Council that makes the decisions. Kofi Annan came and went. All the plans he drew up in his tenure there was all thrown in the trash. And nothing happened. Nothing happened. It is, what it was. And so that's one. So we have now, primarily I think it's been neutered, mostly because it's not in the interest of the ruling elite. It's not in the interest of the United States. It's not in the interest of Israel. It's not in the interest of Saudi Arabia to have this institution. So they've basically defunded it to make it only perhaps responding to some crisis here and there, but not in full force, given that there's wars, 7 years of war in Syria, 3 years of war in Yemen, and we hardly even hear about, every so often we have a report from the UN, but really, they don't keep these issues alive in the media long enough to even really get a grip of our imagination as to what's going on. Largely, they don't even show us what's going on. The media doesn't. The UN apparently has a television station, but I don't see very much footage of any of those crisis zones coming through their television. So our world order, our democracies are in a chaotic state, is one point I want to make. And then I want to show you a little video, and I hope this works, just to remind you, because I think a lot of you have watched this video on a film called The Network, a 1976 film, and this is an amazing moment in television history in relation to the media that I think we should all remind ourselves with, because it tells us what's at stake even today. No sound. many of you have seen this film? Gets the gist of it? So, only a few. Okay, I'm so surprised. Okay. Your volume is up. Mm-hmm. We should have had a rehearsal. Never go on air without a rehearsal. No, that's not it. If you go to, yeah, there you go. Okay, I will leave it for a moment. We'll show it to you when we have our technology sorted out. Sorry about that. All right, the reason I wanted to show you is to just say the moment we are in. It's a crisis. It's extraordinary circumstances, but we've been there before. People have experienced this before, and the frustration of journalism, frustration of journalists, and the frustration of the population is very well represented in this little clip. It's a 1976 film called The Network, and if you get a chance, do watch it. So that part of the presentation was supposed to sort of energize you as journalists as to what's at stake, given the conditions that we are facing. And one of the things that we are facing that I think is absolutely threatening in terms of our existential crisis, in addition to the chaos of the world politics, chaos of what's going on in Washington, the political climates we are living in, the corporate takeover of the world. And one big crisis we are facing is, of course, the environmental crisis. And so, therefore, we've actually established a bureau at the Real News to address this issue, and that is a climate change and environmental crises bureau that Dimitri heads up, and that's why Dimitri is sitting up here, because he's going to assist me in terms of telling you a little bit more about it. Because it's not just, there's chaos in the world order, there's political chaos, there's corporate takeover, but we are facing a serious existential crisis because of the environment, and nobody is paying attention to it. So, Dimitri, Les Caras, I want to actually give Dimitri a proper introduction because it is a unique situation with Dimitri. And so Dimitri in Canada, where he lives in Montreal now, is a class action lawyer that was a lawyer with a very reputable firm in Canada called Siskins. And Siskins was where Dimitri practiced and where he is reputed across the country by the legal profession, is one of Canada's one of 25 of leading lawyers in Canada. He was recognized for that. But Dimitri left his very successful and very satisfying job, I imagine, because as a class action lawyer, you basically represent groups of people who are trying to fight corporations, because he was dealing with securities, class action suits, which seemed to be a very satisfying job, but he's left that job to come and work with the Real News on not only the Environmental Crisis Bureau, but as a number of other topics that he has mastered, including covering the Greek crisis. So, Dimitri?
Thank you, Sharmini. So as Sharmini mentioned, I'm not a journalist by training. In fact, I've received no formal training in journalism at all. There's a considerable overlap in the skill set of a class actions lawyer and a journalist, and one of them is the art of marshaling evidence and supporting facts. Another one is knowing how to ask a question, knowing when you're not receiving a fulsome or accurate answer. There is, however, one big difference between what I do as a lawyer, did as a lawyer, and the art of journalism, and that is a journalist is supposed to, in theory, present the facts in a neutral manner, whereas a lawyer is an advocate for a particular side in a dispute. So I find myself oftentimes, in my capacity as a journalist, having to restrain my adversarial tendencies, which I've acquired over the course of a 25-year career as a lawyer. The way that I became involved with the Real News is an interesting story. My dearest friend, my routine for getting the news when I was a practicing lawyer up until about 2006 was I would take with me to lunch copies of the two largest daily newspapers in Canada, and I'd read them over lunch, and that was essentially how I informed myself about what was going on in the world. And then in 2006, my dearest friend, who happened at that time to be the next door neighbor of Sharmini and Paul, recommended that I read Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. And once I picked that book up, I was unable to put it down. And by the time I was finished, my worldview had been transformed. I think that I can't think of a single book that had a greater impact on me than Manufacturing Consent. So then I went back to my friend and I said, well, now you've destroyed my confidence in the mainstream media. I'm very upset, like that guy up in the film network, mad as hell. I feel I've been deceived my entire life. What do I do now? And he said, well, I think you should check out the Real News. And I hadn't even at that point in time, I had no familiarity with the whole notion of independent journalism, not-for-profit journalism. And within a year, I became an avid follower of the Real News. I now get all of my news from the independent, not-for-profit media, 90% of it at least. Principally the Real News, but not only the Real News. And I've come to understand that if you really want to have objective journalism, it's important to be able to provide that journalism in a way that eliminates dependency upon powerful interests, and the Real News has done that. But as Sharmini said, that imposes certain limitations in terms of our resources. So I started making contributions. I not only was a watcher of the Real News, but my successful legal career allowed me to become a significant donor to the Real News. And then in 2011, I was asked by Paul J. and Sharmini to join the board, which I did. And at that time, the Greek financial crisis was unfolding, and I had a sister who was living in Greece, even though she was born and raised in Canada. She married a Greek man and had 4 children in Corinthos. And Sharmini asked me in private conversation, she learned about the difficulties my sister was experiencing, and she asked me to come on the Real News and as an interviewee and to explain how my sister's life and that of her family had been dramatically degraded by the economic crisis. And by the way, since then, my sister has abandoned Greece and returned to Canada with her 4 children because of the economic crisis. And this led me to become a regular commentator in the Real News about the financial crisis. I wasn't at that stage a journalist, I was simply a commentator about the crisis with which I was becoming increasingly familiar. And I first became, I think, a journalist for the Real News when I came to Greece in 2015 to cover the Greek election. I was quite intrigued by the rise of Syriza. And since then have devoted a very considerable amount of my time and energy to covering the crisis and generally the whole trend of austerity in the European Union. But I was asked after my retirement from the practice of law in 2016 to become more involved in the Real News because the Real News had become convinced that the climate crisis was something of extraordinary importance to our audience and to all humanity, really. It is an existential threat of the highest order. There's nothing that should preoccupy us more than the climate crisis. And Canada has been historically a major contributor to the climate crisis. Canada currently possesses the 2nd largest fossil fuel reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia. The vast majority of these reserves are concentrated in something known as the tar sands in northern Alberta. And basically what the tar sands are is a huge deposit of oil that has been absorbed by the soil. And on top of that soil is a pristine boreal forest, a wonderful, absolutely enchanting boreal forest that is a major carbon sink. And in order for Canadian extractive companies to access that oil, they have to destroy that forest, Then they rake off the topsoil, which contains the oil. And in order to separate the oil from the soil, they have to use enormous quantities of fresh water. And once that fresh water has been employed to separate the oil from the soil, it is left festering in the ground in massive tailings ponds, they're called. And I've flown over the tar sands twice, my capacity as a journalist in a little airplane, and seeing it is a truly horrifying experience. You can see from the edge of the forest, to the operations of the tar sands, this extraordinary hellish transformation in the land. And basically this forest has been replaced by a massive and growing toxic wasteland. That's all it is. Nothing can live there. And in fact, they have these, around these tailings ponds, because when the ducks land in them, they end up dying. So they have these fake, these machines that recreate the sounds of shotguns, hunters' rifles, to scare the ducks from landing on the ponds, because that's an instant death sentence for them. I mean, it's truly a horrific scene. And these tar sand deposits have, of course, created massive amounts of wealth in Canada, and that wealth is deployed by the tar sands industry to control the public discourse about the climate crisis. The Canadian media, unfortunately, are only too happy to oblige. The Canadian media, the newspaper industry in particular, appears to be in terminal decline. It is increasingly dependent upon advertising revenue, and particularly the advertising revenue provided by the all-important fossil fuels industry. One newspaper chain in particular, Post Media, owns 36 of the 90 daily newspapers in the country. It has an extraordinarily right-wing editorial posture, and although it's no longer possible in Canada for a mainstream media organization to engage in climate change denialism, because that would make it a laughingstock, what they do is they systematically ignore the links between extreme weather and climate, and systematically overstate the cost of transforming our economy into one that is sustainable. And so, I, as a journalist, readily accepted the invitation to head the new Climate Crisis Bureau. The media organizations, quite apart from their sort of anti-environmental editorial posture and their dependence upon fossil fuels advertisers, in addition, they've experienced a massive loss of journalistic staff, so they no longer have the capacity that they used to have in order to cover the climate crisis. And we at The Real News, as a result, we will do several stories a week on the climate crisis. We have had the privilege of interviewing leading climate scientists around the world, and we've done some frontline reporting, although our ability, for example, Hurricane Harvey and Irma, although our ability to do that is constrained by our not-for-profit nature. But at the end of the day, it seems to us that the only way that this all-important issue of climate change will be given the attention that it deserves is through a not-for-profit model.
Thank you, Dimitri. So why aren't we hearing about the crisis in the climate as much as we should be hearing about it, given the existential threat it is for the world, for humanity? We are burning up. If you have seen what the scientists have modeled in terms of what it looks like at 1.5 degrees higher, 2 degrees higher, 3 degrees higher, which now the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, is saying is possible within 10 years. If you actually model it, you could no longer live in places like Florida in the United States because of hurricanes and because of melting ice caps and rise in sea levels. Places like Baltimore, where we are, will be flooded to the point that it's unlivable. Any of these coastal cities, island nations will disappear. I'm originally from Sri Lanka. It's a tiny little island. I imagine what they're predicting is the tips of the mountains will survive. Now, given these kinds of situations we are seeing in the mainstream networks, in the entire period leading up to the 2016 presidential elections, less than 56 minutes of all of the major networks in the country reported on the climate. And a lot of them was negative, how this was cooked up by scientists and how there was no climate crises and that it's not scientifically proven, which is the position of the right-wing media. It is also a period where people like the LA Times, even the New York Times, some of the mainstream television networks, who used to have reporters reporting on environment and climate change, also mysteriously got rid of a lot of their reporters on climate change. And there was a period that there was really a desert when it came to journalists covering the environment. And then about 2 years ago, we saw The Guardian pick it up as one of their focuses. But we haven't really seen, even when you have terrible storms and flooding and some of, like Hurricane Maria and others that Dimitri has been on the front line covering, media, even when they're reporting the weather in this way, they never make the link between climate change and fossil fuels and rising temperatures and why this is happening. So this is why we've focused on covering the scientific nature of climate science, climate change, but mostly what can be done about it. So I've already mapped, like, the world is in chaos, but once we start to ask the questions why, like, if you say, why is the UN so dysfunctional? Because not having war, not having Syria, not having space areas to fight and use all the weapons and airplanes and armor that they have is not in the interest of, obviously, the military-industrial complex that horns in on Washington. So these wars are necessary, and continuous and perpetual war is necessary, but not only. The threat, the other big existential threat we are facing, believe it or not, you think this is an issue of the 60s. If you watched the films, what's that film about Dr. Strangelove? The warfare between Russia and the US. You think, oh, that's something of the 60s. But Daniel Ellsberg, who, if you don't know him, he used to work at the RAND Corporation. He became a major whistleblower in the US because he worked for the Pentagon. And he's the one who is responsible for copying all those Pentagon papers and publishing them to expose what was going on in the US. Now, he's written a new book. He's 87 years old, and I was just in California, and we did a series of interviews with him. And he's written a book called The Doomsday Machine, in which he is trying to depart for us the dangers of the current and existing nuclear threats that are there that we don't even think about on a day-to-day basis. Largely, he says, the greatest risk is that these nuclear weapons are not being maintained. There are 2,000 of them pointed at the United States from Russia. And the Russia, especially with the sanctions and the defunding of the state and so on, some of these weapons are actually not maintained to the standards that they need to be. And this goes for the United States as well. I don't know how many thousand weapons are pointed at the Russians, but imagine crossing over Canada in a warfare, in a nuclear warfare. And these threats, he says, are very real, because if you watch the Dr. Strangelove, or if you watch television or films coming out of Hollywood, you think only the president has the code to enter for any nuclear weapon to be dislodged. But Daniel Ellsberg, who worked at the Pentagon, says, oh no, 65 other people have the code as well, and they still do. This is in case that the president is somehow debilitated, that there's various generals out there who also have the code that can trigger a nuclear weapon. Now, on top of that, add the maintenance issue to it, because all they need is crackling sounds on an internet network that triggers it for some of the machines to interpret that as a trigger. And there's a 10-minute window, he says, in Doomsday Machine to reverse a trigger. 10-minute window. So the risk we are saying, when I say a threat to humanity, threat to our survival, it's these kinds of dangers that exist that we are not told about because they don't want the public to actually know that these threats exist. So it's under these circumstances that we are working as journalists, and there is a huge responsibility on our part, not only as just ordinary citizens with children, caretaking for the next generations, but also as journalists, as academics, to do something about this. And that's why I thought that clip from the network was very appropriate. So let me try to play it again, if this works.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I want you to get up right now. Get up, go to your windows, open them, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. Things have got to change.
How many stations does this go out?
You've got to get mad.
67. I know it goes to Louisville and Atlanta.
I'm not going to take this anymore. Then we'll figure out what to do about the depression and the inflation and the oil crisis. But first, get up out of your chairs, open the window, stick your head out and yell, and say, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
All right, with that. It's critical that we assess our media landscape on a regular basis because it is a changing one. It used to be, and those of you who are professors in this area knows and have used charts probably like this one to show that, 6 media companies in the world and owns 90% of the media out there. So everything we see is really filtered for us by these networks. And in the 1980s, there was 90 major media outlets in the United States. Now, even if you add the Googles, the Facebooks, and others, hold on for a second, you will see, even if you add Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, you're now looking at maybe 10 or 11 media outlets out there that control everything we do and see and the way we think. And that includes, people like Netflix, who are now in our cultural milieu, this includes music that we listen to, this includes, cultural activity on television, it includes educational material that our children are watching, and on and on and on. There are many reasons to get mad. And so here's, at The Real News, the way we have tried to organize ourselves is really important for you to hear. We were never interested in putting more information out there in the sea of information for people to consume or not consume. We were critically committed to engaging our audience in the work that we do, because journalists and academics like yourselves investigate, research, we find out information that everyone should know, but we're taking a chance in terms of whether they're actually receiving that information. But we wanted to be critically engaged with our viewers. That is one of the reasons we are in Baltimore as our headquarters and not Washington, D.C. And the reason we're in Baltimore is because it's one of the most depressed cities in the country, just in the backyard of Washington, D.C., in the heart of the empire. Just 30 minutes from there is this city where the extremes in terms of the rich and the poor are so great. It's like any third world country. It was like South Africa or India. You'll see boarded up houses, people unable to pay their water bills. It's not unlike Greece during the crises. It's the elderly not having health care, despite of the fact that Johns Hopkins Hospital and University and most of the pharma companies that interact with this world healthcare institution like Johns Hopkins is in Baltimore. But people are so deprived of access to healthcare, access to public education, access to just basic housing, being able to pay for their electricity, and the extremes of rich and poor is the reason we are in Baltimore, because we were hoping that by virtue of being there, by having a Real News building, being able to recreate what local governments should be doing in terms of engaging their community in resolving and coming up with the solutions for themselves. The municipal governments are absent, they're defunded, they don't have the resources, they don't even have the resources to put into their schools, let alone other activities. So we are critically involved in the community in departing what we are finding in terms of policing. As you know, it's a city in crisis when it comes to white police officers shooting black people in Baltimore and getting away with it. It's a crisis zone. And we wanted to be engaged with the public in discussing public policy, bringing forums and public space back into journalism, where you can actually discuss and debate what the solutions are for the critical problems that the community is facing. And we've had lots of such forums in the space that we have built. We actually have a building. We're not just virtual. We have a building. We have built fairly, like half the size of this room is our main studio, so that we can actually have public forums, discussions, should them share with the other cities that are having similar issues, like Philadelphia, Detroit, other depressed cities in the United States. So that engagement helps us be more relevant in the community. And so that when there's things happening, people call us. We're not like, Fox News or CNN. We're not able to cover it like, oh, this shooting happened in this neighborhood and such, people are involved. We can respond to that, and sometimes we do. But we concentrate more on the efforts that are going on in Baltimore that are more in relation to solutions. What are the solutions that people are working on? For example, the graduate students at Johns Hopkins are in a struggle right now with the university trying to get better salaries. There is election going on in Baltimore, so you can see some of the material that we have covered. In fact, the right-wing conservative governor who's in power right now in Maryland has called us fake news, and I should say that we were the real news 15 years ago, long before Trump came along and started attacking the press for being fake news. But you will see some of the local work we do, and that has been really vital in terms of engaging the African American community, particularly because 67% of Baltimore is African American, and our staff at The Real News also reflect that. So with that, I'll leave you to ask questions in whatever time we have left. You want this mic?
Anybody wants to make a question?
Hi. Hi, my name is Cosmas. I would like to thank you for your presentation. I wasn't familiar with your network, and you seem very, let's say, active. But I would like to ask you, you mentioned that there's no advertising, no government funding, no corporate money, and you just said that you're a member-supported network. And on that, I would like to tell us more about let's say the activities, things that you do in Baltimore or in maybe some other states in order to make yourself publicly available and viable. Yeah.
So as I said, we are free to watch, but we are funded by ordinary citizens who have whatever they can depart, and we have campaigns going on. Usually, we don't like to bombard our viewers like some outfits do. Every so often have things pop up and campaigns. We now run only 2 campaigns a year, one in the summer and one in December. And luckily in places like the US and Canada, people can write off contributions to nonprofit entities like us. And so people are able to make donations, and a portion of it they can write off in their taxes, as they would have given to Red Cross or some other organization. So that's been very useful in the United States and Canada, but we have donations coming in from all over the world, Iran, Palestine. We have an entire group of people that donate to us from US military bases abroad. I was telling Sophia this, which was always shocking for us, because they want to see more programs about the military-industrial complex. They want to see more programs and analysis. We have the former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell under the Bush administration, his name is Lawrence Wilkerson, as a regular commentator on The Real News. And because he's Republican, and he was a whistleblower, and he exposed that there was really no weapons of mass destruction under which, the premise which George W. Bush went to war in Iraq, there was no weapons of mass destruction. He actually exposed that. And even if you see that very famous footage of Colin Powell holding this tube saying, you know, we've found weapons of mass destruction and here's a sample of it. Well, he, after he left the administration, came out and said none of that was true, and he wished he had reported on that at the time. And he doesn't think Colin Powell knew it was not true, but the military fed Colin Powell this information. And so a whole entire war was orchestrated in Iraq with no basis whatsoever. So even the military personnel in these outposts, you know, make whatever donations they can so we can still continue to do interviews with people like Colin Powell where they can get the real story.
1 second. Sharmini, if
You're
you allow
out of time.
me, well, thank you so much, first of all. But for the past 2 days, we've been trying to survive from, you know, the pessimism that we've been hearing on journalism and journalistic methodology or journalistic methods. And all of a sudden we see an example in front of us that survives and does journalism, real journalism. So I have 2 questions. First of all, what is the danger that you feel you are into? Because you don't really live in a free speech country where anybody can say, well, you know, what he feels, first of all. So is there a danger, and what is this? And second of all, what would be your advice to people who strive and they really struggle to see a light in the dark room of journalism nowadays?
Okay.
Thank you.
You know, the question of is there any fear in reporting open and freely? At this moment, we don't think so, but we assume our phones are tapped. We assume that we might even be infiltrated. We assume that we are doing what's constitutionally been granted to us to be able to function as the media. On top of that, we are Canadian, so they can kick us out. Both my husband and I, who heads the Real News, we can be kicked out at any moment. But you know, it's very strange. So we have delegations coming to the Real News, organized by the State Department. Okay, you can laugh. I mean, there's no other media outlet in the United States that's more critical about U.S. foreign policy than we are. Okay, but we've become sort of a little pet project for the State Department. So when they, fund through journalistic outfits training programs in the Ukraine or in the Balkans or in other parts of the world, and they bring those classes or train journalists through the United States to show, there's freedom of expression here, anybody can say whatever they want. We've become that model outfit. So yesterday, in fact, there was a delegation from Ukraine going through the Real News, and we debunk foreign policy of the United States when we meet with these groups, but we've become sort of an example. It's a strange anomaly. You may want to comment on that too, Dimitri.
Well, the only thing I would add is that, and Chomsky talks about this quite a bit, the United States is a deeply flawed democracy. Increasingly, it's questionable whether it can be fairly characterized as a democracy. But freedom of speech is something, and I can confirm this as a lawyer, that is still robustly protected by the courts in the United States. Probably there's more protection, judicial protection of the right to free speech in the United States than any other country in the world, despite its immense flaws. And to a lesser degree, you have the same kind of protection in Canada. The risk that one confronts, and I've had to confront this personally in my own activism, is that the mainstream media, which has a much larger audience, will present a distorted picture of somebody who's critical of the government or critical of powerful interests, and you do not have an opportunity, because the mainstream media will ignore your voice in order to respond to attacks that may be launched against you, or criticisms, unjustified criticisms that are being made against you. So it's in that way that voices of dissent get stifled and ignored. But the risk of, at least up until now, the risk of physical harm coming to a dissenter in this environment is relatively limited. It's not something I think we really think about.
Unless you're a protester.
Yes, yeah. you're on the front line, then it might be
Yeah,
different.
we try to stay on the sidelines.
Right, right.
I have a quick question. Could you comment or say a few words about your social media strategy and how that plays into your overall objectives?
A very important question. We have garnered all the real estate there is when it comes to the internet and more. So on the internet, we are on every platform, from Twitter to Facebook to you name it. You know these places more than I do, but if you just click on any story, for example, which I will, you get little icons here where you can share these stories. So Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, you can send it by email, and there's so many others for you to choose from. So we play on all of these platforms. And Aris earlier was saying that InfoWars was stolen. His title was stolen. And I can't talk about this experience because I am muted by a court decision. But we had a similar experience. And whenever somebody uses our name, we sue them. And we usually win. We've had very, Dimitri, being a lawyer, you're able to talk to these, some of these actions more generally than I can, because you've been involved in it with Paul. But we've successfully sued in the United States, in the state of New York, and we have won our right to all kinds of things, but our domain for sure, the Real News Network, which other people claimed it in the past, and we have won. So in terms of our social media strategy, we actively participate in everything. We go live a lot on Facebook. So whenever there's a demonstration like this one, Johns Hopkins graduate students launch a union campaign. When we are covering things, particularly in our backyard, or in our studio, we go live. We go live whenever we can. And there's something very sexy about live streaming things. People like it. They feel like they're in the throes of breaking news. And so that's one strategy. Another strategy is, we engage. We have about 4 or 5 people dedicated to this in the organization, who are actively on social media all day long, and they promote the material, they engage people, they distribute the information. For example, let's say we do an environmental story. We would make sure, some 650 environmental organizations in the US are tagged on those stories. So then they send it out on their Facebook, and then they send it out to their organizational list. And if one of the other strategies we use is all the people that we interview on The Real News on any given topic, like foreign policy or some research houses or academics and so on, we of course, get them immediately once a story is published. We ask them to share it among their networks. And then we also do a lot of fundraising online. So, you'll see, if you like this, click here and donate. Did I touch something? Okay. He's insisting that you guys stand up and scream. So one of the really important things we do online is we actually fundraise online. So sometimes, let's say we have like a 20-minute interview with somebody significant, like a Daniel Ellsberg or Chomsky or something like that. We will take a clip of the best from that interview, and we will turn it into a 1-minute video as a teaser. So we drive traffic to our site. And we also, the 2 fundraisers we have, we run it on all of these platforms so that people are aware, they come back. The other thing that in terms of our numbers, like we get millions of views on The Real News, depending on the story. And apparently, more views you have, you can convert 0.5% of them into donors. So, this aggregating your stuff and getting it out there is critically important for the kind of donations, because if people like what you're doing, they understand that they have to make a donation. So it's also important at the end of your stories or end of your even print pieces, which we have as well, that you put a link back to your site so that people can donate if they like what they're doing. And we have this situation where, our model is, it's free to watch, and those who can donate, donate. And because of that model, a lot of people actually take our stories and embed it on their sites, and there's no direct link back to our site. So we are losing, let's say, I don't know if you know Naked Capitalism, but that's one site that takes our stuff, and they get thousands of views, this site. And, but they keep our stories right on their site. Like other people will put a link up so it clicks through back to our site, because you have to drive traffic back to your site or to your social media platforms if you expect people to give, if you want to seize that 0.5%. But if it's sitting on somebody's website and it's not getting clicked back, we don't benefit from it. So there were times we've experimented just turning that feature off so people cannot just take material from us. But we just want more people to watch it. So we're not doing that anymore. So anyone can take our material. But that model, that open concept, like Open University, works.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Faith Oloruntoba. I'm currently a doctoral student at Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. And thank you very much for your speech. I think it's really brief what the real news is doing. But I'm still a little bit skeptical, or I still struggle to understand what political spectrum or what political side are you on? Because I do not truly believe that your outfits, I do not really believe in the neutrality of, a news outfit. So if you are on a particular side politically, like perhaps, you have a far left orientation or the far right, what makes you different from other outfits that are also far right, far left, or, that also speak out for the people but still accept funding? And that's the first question. And then the second question, when I mean funding, I mean advertisements and corporate funds. And then the second question is how exactly do you think this is really sustainable in the long run, and for you to have real impact, or, powerful impact in the lives of, the working class or the people you want to defend in the long run without government funding or advertisement or corporate money?
I'll take that last question first. More people that watch the real news, the more donations we get. And every so often there's somebody who's wealthier and they give us a little more money than others. But our model becomes sustainable when millions and millions of people are watching us and is able to make a donation. So we've been able to do what we're doing right now, but if we are really wanting to break through and get to a larger audience and so on, we need more money. So it's a catch-22. We need more money to make that giant leap, and we're working at it every day. More and more people are giving us money every year, but it's a very slow process. So we are currently actually engaged in a organizational analysis as to what we need to do to get to that next level. Because when we built the Real News, we always said our motto was go big or go home. So we are working on this strategy to go big. We think it is, at the moment, it's through social media. It's through advertising. So as a nonprofit, we get Google ads for free. I don't know if you know this, but if you're a not-for-profit and you can apply to Google, and Google will give you $40,000 of free advertising. But you have to use it wisely. You have to do like keyword stuff, and you have to fit into a certain mechanism, but Google does do. So this is where, one could say we are compromised in the sense that we rely on social media, Facebook and Google and others in order to make that giant leap. And in terms of what perspective we are, in terms of politics, right or left or whatever, we don't, as ordinary citizens making an average income as journalists that are, which is most of our staff, we don't pretend that we are impartial. We are very partial. We are partial to ordinary citizens. We are partial to people who are struggling to live. We are partial to people that are unemployed and students who are being, overcharged for the kind of education they're getting. Yeah, we are partial to all those ordinary citizens, so we don't pretend to be not. But we try to do very good journalism, even if it is the students organizing. We'll ask them the critical questions a journalist would ask. Last week we did a story on, there was a protest at Johns Hopkins saying that the medical costs, their insurance plan, was too expensive for ordinary students who don't really, especially for foreign students. But through the inquiry process, we actually found out that Johns Hopkins actually have a crisis response medical unit because they own hospitals. So we will ask them the critical questions, but there is ways that the Johns Hopkins, like Johns Hopkins, you can go to any emergency room and be treated, right? And you can but you'll get thousands of dollars in a bill if you don't have any insurance, but you can also challenge that. So there are mechanisms, but we will ask those critical questions from the students. So we try to do due diligence in terms of journalism, no matter what we are covering. But we don't pretend that we don't have interests. We have interests, and that's the interest of ordinary people out there. Yes.
I'd like to ask 3 questions. One, do you consider your work as investigative journalism? Would you categorize it as such? 2, are you running any risk from the abolition of net neutrality, even in the longer term, not necessarily immediately? And third, how many journalists do you employ?
We put out 5 or 6 stories a day with a staff of about 40 people. And I would say only half of them are journalists, because others are camera people, media workers, editors, and so on. So perhaps even more than that. And then, so we don't have a lot of staff. And I forgot your other question. Oh, net neutrality. Yeah, definitely. There's some states in the United States that have passed very liberal net neutrality regulations, like California just did. And but if the federal government, caves into Comcast and the media outfits out there that will create classes of access, then yeah, we're going to be affected because we have video. In fact, what Aris was talking about in terms of, Facebook's rejigging their technical, what do you call this, algorithms. We saw our numbers, viewers plunge, and we are still struggling to get those viewers back. So we have been decategorized by them, and this is a real problem right now we're trying to tackle with them, because they are, as we learned yesterday, they are monitoring the work we are doing, and they're probably categorizing it as such. Very good question. So if you go to our site, we do our own investigative work in documentary format. And let me just take you down to that place right here. This is a program we have called Reality Asserts Itself. It's hosted by Paul Jay, the CEO of The Real News. In this interview you see with Rana Faruha is exceptional. You should see it because it's also about our world in automation. But we also have cartoons, and right below that you'll see a place, the environment. Maybe it's below that, yeah, TRNN documentaries here. So these documentaries are largely where we do our investigative work. And a lot of them are rather unique. And we wish we could do more. But this is where I think, I don't know, Sophia's left, oh, there she is. Sophia's, one of the missions of this particular session was to get academics, not this session, this whole session as a conference, was to get academics in dialogue with frontline journalists. And we do that. That's something we do very well. Somebody writes a great book that's been well researched and investigated. We're at their door, as soon as those stories are published, or somebody who's done a film, like Michael Moore has done a film. We try to, since we don't have the budget to do investigative work ourselves, we try to take advantage of the work that's out there, where people have spent years researching, investigating, like Danielle Ellsberg, and we are quick on our feet getting to them to be able to do not just like a quick interview of 10 minutes or something, but we do series of them. So if you see here, sorry. You'll see that the Reality Asserts Itself is a very substantial program. Sometimes we've done 12 parts with people in order to expose what they have found in the good academic work they have done. And, or sometimes they're like life stories. So we have this lawyer who's Michael Ratner, who is actually on our board. He used to head up the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, and he was this profound intellectual, but also in practice, because he was in the courts a lot on human rights issues. And so when you do an interview with somebody like that, you try to make, we have like 12 parts with him on different topics available for people. So that's how we get at investigative work, through others.
We have to put an end. It's great, but we are half an hour late already.
I know.